The air in New York City was thick with smoke on the night of April the 6th, 1712. Flames clawed their way into the sky, bells tolled in panic, and the cries of terrified colonists echoed through the narrow streets of Manhattan. What at first looked like a tragic fire was no accident at all. It was vengeance, deliberate, calculated, and burning with a fury that had been building for years. Colonists, rushing through the darkness with buckets of water, were suddenly ambushed. Out of the smoke came figures armed with muskets, swords, and hatchets. They were not demons, but they appeared like shadows risen from the earth, striking down their oppressors with the desperation of men and women who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. 9 white colonists would lie dead before dawn. Many more were left wounded, bleeding in the chaos. And as the city reeled in horror, colonial authorities realized that this was not simply an act of destruction, it was rebellion. It was a declaration that the enslaved would no longer submit quietly to chains. This was the New York Slave Revolt of 1712, one of the earliest and most terrifying uprisings in colonial America. It shocked a city that prided itself on prosperity. It fueled a wave of panic, and it reshaped the laws that governed enslaved people for generations. Before we journey into this haunting chapter of American history, a story of fire, blood, and the desperate cry for freedom, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. We're on a mission to uncover the stories history tried to bury, and we cannot reach our goal of 100,000 subscribers this year without you. Together, let's step back into the night when New York burned with rebellion. The seeds of darkness, slavery in colonial New York. To understand why the revolt of 1712 exploded with such fury, we must first step into the world of New York at the beginning of the 18th century. At this time, New York was not yet the glittering metropolis we know today. It was a bustling colonial port under British rule, a place where cultures clashed, fortunes were made, and, hidden beneath the surface, cruelty was normalized. Unlike the sprawling plantations of Virginia or South Carolina, slavery in New York looked different. Here, enslaved men and women were often used in urban labor, hauling heavy loads at the docks, constructing buildings, and serving in households as domestic servants. They were cooks, blacksmiths, artisans, and field hands working in smaller farms outside the city. Enslaved Africans made up nearly 20% of New York City's population, one of the highest proportions in the northern colonies. But the differences in geography and labor did not soften the brutality. If anything, slavery in New York could be even more suffocating. Enslaved people lived in close proximity to their masters, under constant watch, with little space to form independent communities. They worked long hours, suffered physical punishment, and were denied even the most basic human freedoms, the right to marry, to gather, to worship freely, or to determine their own futures. Governor Robert Hunter, writing in 1712, admitted that enslaved people often endured what he called hard usage. That phrase, hard usage, was a colonial euphemism for what today we would call cruelty, humiliation, and violence. Enslaved Africans were treated as property, but they were not passive objects. They resisted in ways both small and large, through escape attempts, sabotage, and on rare but unforgettable occasions, open revolt. The growing tensions, fear, and control. As the enslaved population grew, so too did the anxiety of white colonists. In New York City, enslaved Africans outnumbered many white residents in certain neighborhoods, Rumors of conspiracies and whispered plans for uprisings circulated in taverns and markets. To the white colonists, these rumors became a constant gnawing fear. What if they rise against us? To keep control, colonial authorities enforced laws designed to suffocate any spark of rebellion. Enslaved people were forbidden to gather in groups larger than 3. They were banned from owning weapons. They were not allowed to trade freely or move about the city without permission. Punishments for breaking these laws were severe, ranging from public whipping to mutilation. But fear breeds resistance, and oppression breeds desperation. The enslaved community, made up of Africans taken from different regions, speaking different languages, and practicing different cultures, began to find unity in suffering. Historians suggest that many of the rebels in 1712 may have been from Akan-speaking regions of West Africa, where traditions of organized resistance and rebellion against enslavement were strong. In other words, they carried not only chains, but also memories of freedom and the knowledge that oppression could be fought. That knowledge, combined with the daily brutality of life in New York, was the spark waiting to ignite. The whisper of rebellion. By early 1712, whispers of defiance had turned into plans. A small group of enslaved men and women began to organize secretly. They knew the risks. Discovery meant torture and death. Yet they also knew that continuing in silence meant a lifetime in chains. For them, the choice was grim but clear. The plan was simple but effective. They would lure white colonists into a trap by setting fire to a building. When colonists rushed to extinguish the flames, the rebels would ambush them with weapons. It was not a battle they expected to win in the long run, but it was a statement. A strike of terror against those who thought the enslaved would always remain powerless. When the night of April 6th arrived, they acted. The night of April 6th, 1712, fire and blood. The evening was quiet at first. Manhattan was still a small colonial town of narrow dirt streets, dim lanterns, and wooden buildings pressed close together. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a group of enslaved men and women slipped into the night, their hearts pounding with the weight of what they were about to do. They carried with them muskets, hatchets, swords, and torches, the weapons not just of war, but of desperation. They crept toward a small building near Maiden Lane. In the silence of the dark, they set it ablaze. Flames began to climb, licking the timbers, crackling in the night air. The glow spread quickly, painting the sky red and filling the streets with the acrid smell of burning wood. Colonists, alarmed by the fire, rushed from their homes. The city rang with the sound of bells as neighbors shouted to one another, "Fire! Fire!" They scrambled with buckets of water, hoping to contain the blaze before it spread through the wooden city. But what they did not know was that the fire itself was bait. From the shadows, the rebels waited. And as the colonists drew near, they struck. The ambush gunfire cracked through the smoke. Hatchets flashed in the firelight. Screams tore through the night as the enslaved, once voiceless, now roared their fury with every blow. 9 colonists fell dead in the chaos. Others staggered away wounded, blood soaking their clothes, their cries echoing against the narrow buildings. Panic swept through the city like wildfire. The rebels had turned New York into a nightmare. One eyewitness later recalled how colonists fled in the utmost terror, not knowing how many rebels there were or where they might strike next. For those few hours, the enslaved had seized the upper hand. Governor Hunter's words, Governor Robert Hunter, in his report to London, described the event as a bloody conspiracy. In his words, "On the 6th of April last, there happened a most horrid conspiracy of the Negroes, rising with a resolution to destroy as many of the inhabitants as they could." Hunter admitted that the cause of the revolt lay in the colonists' own cruelty. The enslaved, he wrote, had rebelled because of the hardisage they had apprehended to have received from their masters. Those simple words, hard usage, hide the reality, years of beatings, starvation, and humiliation. To the enslaved, the fire that night was not just destruction. It was justice. The hunt for rebels, the rebellion itself, was short-lived. The alarm spread, and within hours, armed militias and soldiers mobilized. The rebels, realizing they were outnumbered, fled into the woods and swamps outside the city. Some fought to the death. Others, knowing capture meant torture, took their own lives rather than return to chains. Colonial records state that several rebels made away with themselves to avoid execution. Those who survived were hunted down like animals. Dogs were sent to track them. Militias scoured every barn, swamp, and woodland. Within days, dozens of black men and women, some guilty, some innocent, were rounded up and dragged in chains back to the city. Terror in the streets. The city now shuddered with fear. White colonists whispered of conspiracies, convinced that the revolt had been larger than it really was. Rumors spread of hundreds of enslaved plotting a full-scale massacre. The authorities moved quickly to crush not only the rebels, but also the very possibility of rebellion ever again. Public executions were arranged, not just punishments, but spectacles of terror. One by one, the captured rebels were brought to trial. 27 were convicted. 21 were sentenced to die. And their deaths would not be quick. Some were hanged. Some were broken on the wheel, their bones shattered one by one. Others were burned alive at the stake, their screams echoing over the city as a warning to any enslaved person who might dream of freedom. One man was hung alive in chains and left to starve, his body a rotting reminder that resistance would not be tolerated. Governor Hunter himself wrote that these punishments were the most exemplary that could be thought of, designed not for justice, but for fear. The message of brutality, the authorities wanted the revolt to serve as a lesson. And it did. But not in the way they intended. Yes, the executions terrified many. Yes, the slave codes that followed stripped away even more freedoms, forbidding enslaved Africans from meeting in groups, owning weapons, or even holding traditional forms of worship. The colonists sought total control. But the revolt also left another legacy. It proved beyond all doubt that enslaved men and women were not passive property. They could plan. They could fight. And they were willing to risk and even sacrifice their lives in the pursuit of freedom. As historian Leslie Harris later wrote, the revolt shattered the illusion of safety among New York's colonists. It was a reminder that beneath the surface of prosperity, the city was built on the fragile foundation of human bondage. The events of that night became etched into the city's memory as both a nightmare and a warning. Trials and executions. In the weeks after the revolt, New York was transformed into a stage of fear and brutality. The trials were swift, but they were not trials in the sense of justice. They were rituals of power, carefully orchestrated to remind the enslaved who ruled the city. Colonial judges interrogated the accused under the looming threat of torture. Confessions were wrung out, whether true or false. And when sentences were read, the punishments were not designed simply to kill. They were designed to horrify. 21 enslaved Africans were executed. Some swung from gallows, their bodies left to dangle in the wind as warnings. Others were burned alive, their screams filling the night as colonists watched in silence, some in grim approval, others in quiet unease. One rebel was broken on the wheel, his bones shattered one by one while still alive. Another was chained and left to die slowly of starvation, his decaying body becoming a grotesque landmark for all to see. Governor Robert Hunter defended these atrocities in his report to Queen Anne, writing that they were the most exemplary punishments that could be thought of. His words carried no shame, only calculation. The executions were not just about punishment. They were about control. The birth of harsher laws, but the executions were not enough for the ruling class. Fear had burrowed deep into their hearts. If a few dozen enslaved men and women could terrify an entire colony, what might hundreds do? In response, New York's lawmakers drafted new slave codes, laws that tightened the chains on every black person in the colony, enslaved or free. Enslaved people were forbidden from gathering in groups larger than 3 or 4. They were banned from owning weapons of any kind. Curfews were imposed, forcing them indoors by nightfall. And even free black people were targeted, their rights stripped away as suspicion painted every person of African descent a potential conspirator. These laws were not written in the ink of justice, but in the ink of fear. They codified racial control and transformed New York into a society of surveillance where black bodies were monitored, restricted, and punished at the slightest suspicion. A city living in fear, the revolt had left its scar not only on the enslaved, but also on the colonists. White New Yorkers walked the streets with new suspicion, whispering of conspiracies, watching their servants, and fearing what might be whispered in the quarters at night. Every fire that broke out in the years to come was viewed with dread. Every rumor of discontent among the enslaved was treated as a potential uprising. In truth, the revolt had revealed a terrifying fact for the colonists. Their prosperity, their wealth, even their sense of security rested on the backs of men and women who longed to be free and who had proven they would kill for that freedom. The revolt had pulled back the mask. It showed that New York, like the plantations of the Caribbean or the fields of the South, was built on the edge of a knife. Echoes of rebellion, though crushed with blood and fire, the revolt of 1712 was not the end of resistance. It was the beginning of a long struggle that would continue for generations. Just 29 years later, in 1741, New York was once again gripped by panic in what came to be known as the New York Conspiracy Trials. Dozens of enslaved people, and even some poor whites, were accused of plotting another uprising. Many were executed or exiled, though historians today believe most of the accusations were fueled more by paranoia than fact. The shadow of 1712 hung over the city for decades, shaping its laws, its culture, and its fear. Historical reflection. Modern historians look back at the revolt of 1712 not simply as an act of violence, but as a desperate cry for justice in a world of chains. Historian Jill Lepore describes the revolt as a rebellion against slavery, but also against the hypocrisy of a city that prided itself on liberty while denying it to so many. And Leslie Harris, in her study of slavery in New York, wrote, "The revolt shattered the illusion of safety among New York's colonists. It was a reminder that beneath the wealth of the city, lay the constant threat of rebellion, born from the unyielding desire for freedom. The revolt, and the brutal response to it, remind us that history is not only shaped by kings and governors, but also by the enslaved men and women who refused to remain silent. Seeds of resistance. Though the revolt of 1712 was crushed with unspeakable violence, its impact was not erased. Every lash of the whip, every public execution, every tightening of the laws only reminded the enslaved population of one truth: freedom would never be given. It had to be taken. Whispers of the revolt survived in oral traditions, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Mothers and fathers told their children of the night the sky burned red, and enslaved men stood like warriors against impossible odds. These stories, though muted by fear, planted seeds of resistance that would grow in different forms across the colonies. The rebellion became part of a larger pattern of uprisings that terrified slaveholders throughout the Americas, from the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, 1739, to the massive slave revolts in the Caribbean, and ultimately the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century. 1712 was not the end. It was the beginning of a whisper that would one day roar. The hypocrisy of liberty. What makes the New York Slave Revolt especially chilling is where it happened. This was not a remote plantation in the Caribbean. This was New York, the beating heart of trade, a city that would later pride itself on being a cradle of freedom. But in 1712, freedom was a luxury reserved only for some. The revolt exposed the brutal hypocrisy of a society that preached liberty while profiting from chains. In Governor Hunter's own words to Queen Anne, the revolt had shown how dangerous it was to admit so many Negro slaves into so small a compass. To him and the ruling class, the lesson was to tighten control. But to history, the lesson is far different. Liberty cannot coexist with bondage. The revolt is a scar on New York's past, but also a mirror. It forces us to ask, how many times has the cry for freedom been silenced, ignored, or buried beneath the ashes of rebellion? Memory in silence. For centuries, the revolt of 1712 remained a little-known episode, whispered in scholarly texts, but rarely taught in schools. Its memory was overshadowed by other events, often dismissed as a footnote in the grand narrative of colonial America. Yet silence does not mean absence. In 2011, nearly 300 years after the revolt, archaeologists uncovered the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, the resting place of thousands of enslaved men and women. Their bones bore the scars of hard labor, malnutrition, and violence. And though the revolt is not etched into those bones, the longing for freedom surely is. The discovery forced the city to confront a truth it had long ignored. New York was not simply a city of commerce and liberty. It was a city built on slavery, a city where the blood of the enslaved literally soaked the ground. The legacy for abolition. When abolitionists in the 18th and 19th centuries spoke out against slavery, the revolt of 1712 stood as both a warning and an inspiration. To defenders of slavery, it was proof that the enslaved were dangerous and must be controlled. To abolitionists, it was proof that no human being could endure bondage without eventually rising up. As Frederick Douglass would later declare, the thing worse than rebellion is the thing that causes rebellion. Though Douglass spoke more than a century after 1712, his words echo the truth of that night. The revolt was not mindless savagery. It was the inevitable result of chains, cruelty, and hypocrisy. A haunting conclusion, and so we return to that night, April 6, 1712. A night of smoke, blood, and fire. A night when men and women, stripped of everything but their will to be free, set a city ablaze to remind their oppressors that human beings cannot be owned. Yes, they were executed. Yes, their revolt was crushed. But their courage still lingers in the shadows of New York's history. Their screams still echo in the city's oldest streets. Their fire still burns, not in buildings, but in memory. The New York Slave Revolt of 1712 is more than a forgotten rebellion. It is a haunting reminder that even in the darkest corners of oppression, the flame of freedom refuses to die. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of those flames, the cries of those who refuse to live as slaves, then help us bring more buried history to light. Like this video, subscribe, and share it so others can learn the truths our textbooks too often ignore. We're on a journey to reach 100,000 subscribers this year, and every one of you is part of that mission. Together, we can uncover the shadows, tell the stories of the silenced, and ensure that the voices of the oppressed are never forgotten again. Because history is not just the story of rulers and empires. It is also the story of the enslaved, the silenced, and the rebels who dared to strike against the night.